Greetings, my fellow adventurers. It's Elara. Welcome back to our cozy sanctuary, where the foggy streets of Victorian London and the brilliance of deductive minds come alive in tales of mystery, intrigue, and unexpected revelations. Tonight, we'll delve into the world of the great detective, Sherlock Holmes, as he unravels a case shrouded in secrets, deception, and the eternal quest for justice. So, find your coziest spot. Let the intrigue of Baker Street and the shadows of London's alleys spark your imagination, and prepare to be carried away on a tale of cunning deduction, perilous discoveries, and the triumph of truth. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and which adventures you'd love to hear next. Let's begin. The city of London was swathed in a dense, all-encompassing fog that smothered the gaslights and dulled the sound of clattering carriages. It was one of those late autumn evenings when the air felt heavy with an unshakable chill. Yet, within the walls of 221B Baker Street, a warm fire crackled in the hearth, illuminating the room with a comforting glow. Sherlock Holmes sat in his well-worn armchair, the delicate curves of his violin resting across his lap. His lean, hawk-like features were cast in stark relief by the flickering firelight, and his sharp eyes gleamed with a peculiar brightness. Across from him, Dr. John Watson was seated at his desk, busily scribbling the latest account of their recent escapades. The silence between them was companionable until Holmes tilted his head toward the door, his expression sharpening. "The irregularity of our visitor's footsteps, Watson. Have you noticed it?" Watson paused mid-sentence, setting his pen down. He listened intently, but heard nothing save the low hum of the fire. "I can't say I have," he admitted, glancing toward the door. Holmes offered a faint smile, a gesture that carried both amusement and the faintest hint of condescension. "A woman," he said, his tone laced with certainty. "A widow, to be precise. Her steps falter with hesitation, but it is a hesitation born not of fear, but of necessity." Before Watson could formulate a response, a knock echoed through the room. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed soon after, carrying her usual warmth. "Mr. Holmes, there's a lady here to see you. Shall I show her in?" "Do, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied, rising from his chair and straightening his jacket. His sharp features betrayed a flicker of intrigue, though he made an effort to keep his tone casual. When the door opened, the visitor stepped inside, her figure framed by the soft glow of the hallway lamp. She was a woman of about 35, dressed in the heavy black garb of mourning. Her chestnut hair was hastily pinned back, and her storm-gray eyes darted around the room, searching for reassurance. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Then, turning her gaze to the doctor, she added, "And Dr. Watson, I presume?" Watson nodded, gesturing toward the chair opposite Holmes. "Please, take a seat." The woman settled herself with an air of nervous urgency, clutching her handbag tightly as though it were a shield. Holmes observed her in silence, his keen eyes taking in every detail, from the faint scuff marks on her shoes to the ink stains on her gloves. "You've come at a late hour, Mrs. Holmes prompted, his tone polite but pointed. "Edwards," Amelia Edwards, she replied, her fingers tightening around the clasp of her handbag. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I had no choice. The matter is urgent. Then please, Mrs. Edwards, tell us everything, Holmes said, settling back into his chair. His gaze remained fixed on her, unblinking and intense. Mrs. Edwards hesitated, drawing a shaky breath. It concerns my late husband, Mr. Holmes. Henry passed away 6 months ago. The coroner ruled it as natural causes, heart failure. But lately, I have begun to doubt that conclusion. Watson leaned forward slightly, his medical instincts piqued. What led you to question it? He asked gently. Mrs. Edwards glanced between the two men, as if gauging their trustworthiness. Strange things began happening after his death, she said. I started receiving letters, unsigned and filled with cryptic messages. They spoke of betrayal, secrets, and, most disturbingly, murder. Holmes's expression did not change, but a glimmer of interest lit his eyes. Murder, you say? And these letters, do you have them with you? Yes. She reached into her handbag, producing a small bundle of papers, tied with a ribbon. She handed them to Holmes, who accepted them with the precision of a surgeon. As Holmes examined the letters, Watson studied their guest. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, and her gaze frequently darted toward the window, as if she feared being watched. Holmes broke the silence, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Fascinating. The handwriting varies slightly between letters, an obvious attempt to obscure the writer's identity. And yet, the tone remains consistent, hinting at a deep familiarity with your late husband's affairs. Mrs. Edwards nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Henry was a businessman, Mr. Holmes. His investments were extensive, and his dealings were often complex. But there is one person who stands out, a man named James Halcroft. He was my husband's closest partner, though I've always found him unsettling. In what way? Holmes asked, his tone calm but probing. He's been asking questions about Henry's private documents that should no longer exist, she said. And since Henry's death, his demeanor has been cold, almost calculating. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. And these documents, what might they contain? Financial records, I believe. Perhaps contracts or ledgers. Henry always kept them locked away, even from me. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And yet you've chosen not to involve the police. Why? Her face clouded with fear. Because I don't know whom I can trust, Mr. Holmes. These letters, they imply a conspiracy, one that could be far-reaching. If I go to the authorities, I risk alerting those responsible. And, she hesitated, her voice trembling, and I fear for my safety. Holmes regarded her in silence for a moment, then rose to his feet with an air of decision. You were right to come here, Mrs. Edwards. Rest assured, Dr. Watson and I will look into this matter. Tell me, where can I find this James Halcroft? He works out of an office near Fleet Street, she said, and he owns a townhouse in Bloomsbury. Excellent. Watson, prepare your coat and revolver. We may need it. Watson frowned, but complied. Holmes's instincts, though often inscrutable, had rarely led them astray. As Mrs. Edwards left, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering dread, Watson turned to his companion. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "A puzzle, Watson. One of greed, betrayal, and, perhaps, murder. But there is something else, something elusive. We must uncover it." With that, Holmes donned his coat and hat, his posture alive with purpose. Outside, the fog thickened, but for Sherlock Holmes, the night was just beginning. Holmes and Watson stepped out of 221B Baker Street, their breaths visible in the frosty air, as they hailed a cab bound for Fleet Street. Holmes appeared particularly energized, his sharp features alight with a rare sense of anticipation. Watson, on the other hand, was more subdued, the weight of Mrs. Edwards's story lingering in his mind. The cryptic letters, the mysterious James Halcroft, and the possibility of murder, all of it painted a troubling picture. As the cab rattled through the narrow streets of London, Holmes remained silent, his fingers steepled in thought. Watson knew better than to interrupt him during these moments of concentration, instead occupying himself with the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the cobblestones and the muffled din of the city. When they arrived at Fleet Street, the bustling thoroughfare was alive with activity. Vendors hawked newspapers, their voices cutting through the morning air, while clerks and laborers hurried past, their faces set with purpose. The building Holmes sought was an unassuming brick structure, wedged between a printer's shop and a tobacconist. Holmes led the way up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where a polished brass plate beside a door read, "Halcroft and Partners, Investments and Holdings." Without hesitation, Holmes rapped sharply on the door. A moment later, a clerk in his early 20s answered, his expression polite but guarded. "May I help you, gentlemen?" "We are here to see Mr. Halcroft," Holmes said, his tone firm but cordial. "Please inform him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes wishes to speak with him on a matter of some urgency." The clerk hesitated, his eyes flicking over Holmes and Watson as if weighing the legitimacy of their claim. Finally, he nodded. "One moment, please." As the clerk disappeared into the adjoining office, Holmes turned to Watson, his voice low. "Observe the details, Watson. The faint scent of tobacco mixed with ink. Evidence of forged documents, perhaps, and the clerk's hesitation, indicative of either loyalty or fear." Before Watson could respond, the clerk returned, gesturing for them to enter. "Mr. Halcroft will see you now." The office was tastefully furnished, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with ledgers and books. Behind a large mahogany desk sat James Halcroft, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. He rose to greet them, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, extending a hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" Holmes shook his hand briefly, his piercing gaze never leaving Halcroft's face. "We have come to discuss your late business partner, Mr. Henry Edwards." and some troubling circumstances surrounding his death. Halcroft's smile faltered ever so slightly, though he quickly regained his composure. A tragedy, indeed. Henry was a brilliant man and a dear friend, but I fail to see how I might assist you. Perhaps you might begin by explaining your recent inquiries into Mr. Edwards' private documents, Holmes suggested, his tone mild, but pointed. Halcroft's eyes narrowed. Those inquiries were purely professional. Henry and I shared many ventures, and I had hoped to locate certain records to ensure the continuity of our business. And yet, Holmes said, taking a step closer, you made these inquiries not to Mrs. Edwards, but through indirect channels. An unusual approach, wouldn't you agree? Halcroft's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. Mrs. Edwards has been under considerable strain since her husband's passing. I did not wish to burden her further. Holmes smiled faintly, a gesture that held no warmth. How very considerate of you. The tension in the room was palpable, and Watson felt an urge to intervene, but Holmes pressed on. Tell me, Mr. Halcroft, are you familiar with these? He produced the bundle of letters Mrs. Edwards had provided, placing them on the desk. Halcroft's expression darkened as he glanced at the letters. I've never seen these before, he said curtly. What are they? Anonymous messages, suggesting betrayal and murder, Holmes replied, his tone sharp. And they appear to be connected to Mr. Edwards's death. You can understand why I might find that intriguing. Halcroft's composure cracked slightly, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Holmes? Not at all, Holmes said smoothly. I am merely gathering information. If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. For a moment, Halcroft said nothing, his jaw working as though suppressing an angry retort. Finally, he exhaled sharply. You are welcome to investigate, Mr. Holmes, but you will find nothing incriminating here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a great deal of work to attend to. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Of course. Good day, Mr. Halcroft. As they left the office, Watson cast a questioning glance at Holmes. What do you make of him? A man under pressure, Holmes replied. He hides something, Watson. Of that I am certain. But whether it is guilt or merely self-preservation remains to be seen. The two men returned to the street, where the morning mist had begun to lift, revealing a crisp blue sky. Holmes paused, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. Our next step, he said, is to visit Halcroft's townhouse in Bloomsbury. I suspect we may find something there that he would prefer to keep hidden. As they hailed another cab, Watson couldn't help but feel a growing unease. The deeper they delved into this case, the more it seemed to twist and turn, like a labyrinth with no clear end. Yet, as always, he trusted Holmes's instincts implicitly. If anyone could untangle this web of secrets and lies, it was Sherlock Holmes. And so, they set off once more, the riddle of the Silver Widow drawing them ever deeper into its shadowy depths. As Holmes and Watson approached the townhouse in Bloomsbury later that evening, the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. The building loomed over the narrow street, its brick facade demi-lit by a single gas lamp. Holmes paused at the foot of the steps, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The faint scuff marks on the door, the slightly ajar curtains in one window. "The house is quiet," Holmes murmured. "Too quiet for an occupied residence. Come, Watson, keep your revolver close." Watson gave a curt nod, his unease growing with every step. They ascended the stairs, and Holmes reached for the door handle. Without hesitation, he twisted it, finding it unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened hallway faintly illuminated by the moonlight streaming through a window at the far end. Holmes stepped inside, his movements deliberate and silent. Watson followed, clutching his revolver tightly. The air inside the townhouse was stale, carrying the faint scent of tobacco and old paper. "Do you smell that, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice low. "The air hasn't circulated here for some time. Halcroft is not here." "Then why is the door unlocked?" Watson whispered. "Perhaps we are meant to find something, or someone," Holmes replied cryptically. They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The sitting room was sparsely furnished, with an air of neglect that suggested it hadn't been used in weeks. But it was the study, located at the back of the house, that drew Holmes's attention. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and Holmes pushed it open with the tip of his cane. The room was cluttered with papers, ledgers, and an overturned chair. A single candle burned on the desk, its weak flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. Holmes moved swiftly to the desk, scanning the documents spread across its surface. His keen eyes fell upon a ledger marked with Halcroft's name. He opened it, flipping through the pages with practiced precision. "Watson, look here," he said, pointing to a series of entries. Halcroft was involved in a number of questionable transactions. Large sums of money transferred to anonymous accounts, investments in phantom companies. It seems our friend was not as loyal to Edwards as he claimed. Before Watson could respond, a noise from the hallway froze them both. A faint creak, like the weight of a footstep on an old floorboard. Holmes extinguished the candle with a quick motion and gestured for Watson to stay silent. They moved to the shadows, pressing themselves against the wall as the faint sound of footsteps grew closer. The door to the study creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man, dressed in a dark overcoat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He carried a lantern, its light sweeping across the room. Holmes waited until the man was fully inside before stepping forward. "Good evening," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The man spun around, startled, but quickly composed himself. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I might ask you the same question," Holmes replied calmly, "but I suspect I already know the answer. James Halcroft, I presume?" The man hesitated, then removed his hat, revealing a gaunt face and piercing eyes. "You're Holmes," he said, his tone wary. "Indeed. And you, Mr. Halcroft, have some explaining to do." Halcroft's eyes darted to the desk, where the ledger lay open. "You've been snooping through my affairs," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Merely uncovering the truth," Holmes replied. "The truth about your betrayal of Henry Edwards. You used him, manipulated him, and when he became inconvenient, you eliminated him." "That's absurd," Halcroft snapped, though his voice betrayed a flicker of panic. "You have no proof." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "The ledger speaks volumes. And then there are the letters, written by you, no doubt, to sow fear and confusion in Mrs. Edwards. But the real question is why? What was so important that you were willing to kill for it?" Halcroft's composure cracked, and he took a step back. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Henry found out about the embezzlement. He threatened to expose me." "So, you silenced him," Holmes said coldly. "And now you're here, likely to destroy any remaining evidence." Before Halcroft could respond, a sudden noise from outside startled them all. A sharp whistle, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Police," Halcroft hissed, his face pale. "You set me up." Holmes remained unflinching. "Justice, Mr. Halcroft. It always finds its way." The door burst open, and 2 uniformed officers entered, their expressions stern. "Mr. Halcroft, you're under arrest for suspicion of embezzlement and the murder of Henry Edwards," one of them announced. Halcroft tried to protest, but his words fell on deaf ears as the officers led him away. Holmes watched impassively, his sharp mind already moving to the next steps. As the house fell silent once more, Watson turned to Holmes. "Well, that was quite the finale. But how did you arrange for the police to arrive at just the right moment?" Holmes allowed himself a small smile. "A simple telegram, sent before we left Baker Street. I had a feeling Halcroft wouldn't be able to resist returning to the scene of his crimes." Watson shook his head in amazement. "And yet, you make it all seem so effortless." "Effortless, Watson, is merely the result of careful planning and observation," Holmes said. "Now, let us return home. There is much to document, and I believe Mrs. Edwards will sleep easier, knowing that justice has been served." As they stepped out into the crisp night air, the fog had lifted, revealing a clear sky filled with stars. As Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the familiar flicker of the fireplace did little to warm the icy weight of their thoughts. Though James Halcroft had been apprehended, Holmes's sharp instincts had not let him rest. Something about the case still lingered in the shadows, just out of reach. Holmes paced the sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back, the sharp lines of his face illuminated by the firelight. Watson sat nearby, his notebook open, awaiting Holmes' thoughts. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice steady, but with an edge of frustration. "Halcroft's arrest was only part of the puzzle. There are threads yet unpulled, details that do not align." "Such as?" Watson asked, leaning forward. "For one, the letters to Mrs. Edwards," Holmes replied. "Their purpose remains ambiguous. If Halcroft intended to frighten her into submission, why not confront her directly? And why was the handwriting inconsistent, yet subtly so, as if intended to mislead?" Watson frowned. "Do you suspect another player in this, Holmes?" "Indeed," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "Someone with a vested interest in silencing Henry Edwards. Halcroft may have been the mastermind, but he was not alone in this scheme." Before Watson could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression tense. "Inspector Lestrade is here to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "Show him in," Holmes replied, his expression unreadable. Lestrade entered, his face grim. "Holmes, I thought you'd want to hear this firsthand. Halcroft is dead." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Watson rose to his feet, his expression one of disbelief. "Dead?" Holmes repeated, his tone sharp. "How?" "Poison," Lestrade said. "He was found in his cell. Not an hour ago. It seems he took his own life. But the circumstances are peculiar." Holmes's eyes glittered with intrigue. "Peculiar, you say?" Lestrade nodded. "The poison was in a small vial, hidden on his person. We suspect he smuggled it in before his arrest. But here's the odd part. There was a note addressed to you." "To me?" Holmes said, his brows lifting slightly. "How curious. Do you have it?" Lestrade handed over the note, sealed with a simple wax stamp. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Mr. Holmes, you have played your part well, but the game is far from over. You will not uncover the truth, for the truth is buried deeper than you can reach." Holmes read the note aloud, his expression unreadable. Watson frowned, his unease growing. "What does it mean?" Watson asked. "It means," Holmes said, folding the note carefully, "that our adversary is far more cunning than we anticipated." Lestrade cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Halcroft's townhouse. Someone broke in shortly after his arrest. The place has been ransacked." Holmes' eyes flashed with determination. "Then we must return there immediately. The answers lie in the details, Watson, and I intend to uncover them." The night was dark as Holmes and Watson arrived once more at Halcroft's townhouse. The scene was eerily quiet, the faint light of a gas lamp casting long shadows on the cobblestones. Inside, the study was in disarray. Papers were strewn across the floor, the desk drawers pulled out and emptied. Holmes moved through the room with purpose, his keen eyes scanning every corner. "Whoever did this was searching for something specific," he murmured. "But what?" He knelt by the desk, his fingers brushing over a small, hidden compartment beneath it. With a deft movement, he opened it, revealing a leather-bound journal. "Ah," Holmes said softly, holding the journal up. "Watson, this may be what they were after." He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more intense with each entry. The journal was filled with detailed accounts of Halcroft's dealings, but one entry in particular caught his attention. "Listen to this," Holmes said. "Met with an unnamed partner today. They provided the letters for Mrs. Edwards, as per the plan. Their motives remain unclear, but their resources are invaluable." "A partner?" Watson echoed. "Do you think this partner orchestrated Halcroft's death?" "It is likely," Holmes said, closing the journal. "Halcroft became a liability. Eliminating him ensures silence." As Holmes spoke, his eyes landed on a smudged footprint near the study door. He crouched to examine it, his expression sharpening. "A distinctive boot print," he noted. "Watson, Do you recall the clerk at Halcroft's office? His shoes bore the same pattern. You think the clerk is involved? Watson asked, surprised. I think, Holmes said, rising, that the clerk is a pawn, much like Halcroft. But pawns can lead us to kings. Holmes pocketed the journal and turned to Watson. Come, we must visit the office again. Time is of the essence. The office of Halcroft and Partners was dark when they arrived, but Holmes quickly picked the lock, his movements swift and precise. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the shadows stretching long in the faint light of their lantern. Holmes moved to the clerk's desk, his fingers deftly searching through the drawers. At last, he found a small bundle of letters, tied with a string. The handwriting matched the letters sent to Mrs. Edwards. Here it is, Holmes said, holding up the bundle. Proof that the clerk was involved. But who gave the orders? Watson asked. Holmes' eyes glinted. That is what we must discover next. As they turned to leave, a faint noise stopped them, a soft creak, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Holmes motioned for Watson to remain silent as they moved toward the source of the noise. In the dim light, they saw a figure slipping out of a back door. Holmes pursued without hesitation, Watson close behind. The chase led them through narrow alleys and darkened streets, the figure always just out of reach. At last, they cornered the figure in a dead-end alley. It was the clerk, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. Please, he stammered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Then tell us everything, Holmes said, his voice cold. Who is behind this? The clerk hesitated, his fear palpable. I don't know their name, he admitted. They always wore a mask, but they promised me money, said it was just to scare Mrs. Edwards, to keep her quiet. And the poison? Holmes pressed. They gave it to Halcroft, the clerk said. Said it was a precaution in case he was caught. Holmes studied the clerk for a long moment before nodding. You will accompany us to Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade will be very interested in what you have to say. As the clerk was led away, Watson turned to Holmes. Do you believe him? For now, Holmes said. But the true mastermind remains in the shadows, and that is where we must turn our attention next. With the journal and the clerk's testimony in hand, Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. But the game was not yet over, and Holmes knew that the final move would determine everything. As they sat by the fire that night, Holmes turned to Watson, his expression one of steely determination. The truth, Watson, he said, is always in the details. And tomorrow, we will bring it to light. The case was far from over, but Holmes felt the thrill of the hunt coursing through him. The final act was about to begin. The morning dawned cold and gray, the chill of London creeping through the windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes sat in his armchair, his fingers steepled as he stared into the fire. Watson, ever the loyal companion, sat across from him, his notebook open and pen poised. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken questions, and the weight of unresolved mysteries. We have reached the final act, Watson, Holmes said at last, his voice measured. Our adversary has played their hand with cunning precision, but they have underestimated one vital truth. "And what is that?" Watson asked. "That every thread, no matter how tangled, eventually leads to its source," Holmes replied. He stood abruptly, his energy renewed. "We must return to the scene of Halcroft's dealings. There is one final piece of evidence yet to uncover." The streets of London bustled with their usual chaos as Holmes and Watson made their way to Halcroft and Partners. The office was quiet, its facade unassuming, but Holmes's sharp eyes took in every detail. He motioned for Watson to follow as he approached the door, unlocking it with practiced ease. Inside, the office was as they had left it, papers scattered and drawers emptied. Holmes moved swiftly to the clerk's desk, his fingers tracing the edges of the wood. He crouched, examining the underside, and then gave a small, satisfied nod. "There," he murmured, prying loose a hidden panel. Within, he found a folded piece of parchment, its edges yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "What is it?" Watson asked, leaning over his shoulder. "A letter," Holmes said, his voice taut with anticipation. "From Halcroft to his unnamed partner." The letter read, "The plan proceeds as discussed. The letters have been sent, and Edwards will soon be silenced. Your payment has been secured, as agreed. However, your insistence on secrecy concerns me. If we are discovered, it will be my neck on the line, not yours. I hope you understand the risks involved." Holmes folded the letter, his expression grim. "This confirms it, Watson. Halcroft was working with a partner, someone who orchestrated the entire scheme, but remained hidden in the shadows." "But who could it be?" Watson asked. "That," Holmes said, tucking the letter into his coat, "is what we are about to find out." Their next stop was a small tavern on the outskirts of the city, a place Holmes had discovered through Halcroft's records. The tavern was dimly lit, its air thick with the smell of smoke and stale ale. Holmes scanned the room, his gaze landing on a figure seated in the corner. The man was unremarkable at first glance, his plain clothes and weathered face blending in with the surroundings, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a vigilance that set him apart. Holmes approached the man, his steps deliberate. "Good evening," he said, his tone polite but firm. "You are Mr. Arthur Bryce, are you not?" The man looked up, his expression cautious. "Who's asking?" "Sherlock Holmes," came the reply, the name cutting through the air like a blade. "I believe you have some answers to provide." Bryce's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Holmes took a seat across from him, his gaze unwavering. "You were Halcroft's partner," Holmes said, his voice calm but relentless. "You provided the letters, orchestrated the scheme, and ensured Edwards's demise. Halcroft was merely a pawn in your game." Bryce smirked, though it lacked humor. "You've got a vivid imagination, Mr. Holmes." "Do I?" Holmes countered, producing the letter he had found. "This correspondence suggests otherwise. Halcroft's fears were justified, it seems." For a moment, Bryce's mask slipped and his expression darkened, but he quickly regained his composure. "Even if what you say is true, you've got no proof tying me to Edwards's death." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "On the contrary, the poison used to kill Halcroft was unique. a rare compound only accessible to a select few. A compound that, coincidentally, was found in your possession during a prior investigation. Bryce's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of alarm. "You've got nothing," he hissed. "Enough to bring you to justice," Holmes said, standing. "Inspector Lestrade will be most interested in hearing what you have to say." Back at Scotland Yard, Bryce's interrogation revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. Halcroft had been recruited to embezzle funds and eliminate Edwards, who had discovered the scheme. Bryce, the true mastermind, had remained in the shadows, pulling the strings and ensuring his own hands stayed clean. As Bryce was led away in chains, Watson turned to Holmes. "Another case solved, thanks to your brilliance." Holmes gave a small smile. "Justice, Watson, is not always swift, but it is inevitable, and in this case, it has been served." That evening, as they sat in their familiar sitting room, Watson poured them each a glass of brandy. "A toast," he said, raising his glass, "to truth and justice." "To the pursuit of both," Holmes replied, clinking his glass against Watson's. The fire crackled softly as they sat in companionable silence. The weight of the case finally lifted, yet Holmes's sharp mind was already turning, searching for the next challenge, the next puzzle to unravel. For Sherlock Holmes, the game was never truly over. As the tale of Sherlock Holmes and his relentless pursuit of truth draws to a close, let this story remind us of the brilliance found in unwavering determination and the courage to uncover justice amidst shadows of deceit. Remember, my fellow adventurers, that in the fog of mystery, it is the clarity of thought and the strength of character that illuminate the path forward. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the flicker of gaslights, the echoes of Baker Street, and the thrill of new enigmas waiting to unfold. Good night.